This week we are covering the process of photosynthesis. Everything about plants is structured around this process. This is how plants eat. So much like humans, we move around. We've got great eyesight in the front of our face to be able to find food. We are attracted to bright colors and movement. We have grasping hands, we have legs that can run. All of that stuff has to do with interactions with each other, yes, but also the ability to find food. So a lot of plant structure has to do with their ability to access food. And their food they get from being stationary, right? So plants don't have to move to get sunlight necessarily, or they can't move. They're sessile organisms. And the amount of energy that they get from photosynthesis wouldn't be enough for them to be like running around moving organisms. So part of that sessile lifestyle, being stationary, has to do with the amount of energy that they're able to get from photosynthesis. So plants are stationary, trying to get access to sunlight. You want to have access to sunlight, but in a way that you don't get so much that you get too hot and lose water. So there's this always a fine balance between temperature, sunlight access, and water availability. And all of that will determine sort of plant structure and function, what they look like, different adaptations that they have. So this week we'll be looking at that. So the haiku for this week is photons energy sent through the electron chain and stored in glucose. The important part here is our photosynthetic equation. So this is just the words behind the molecules. We're going to take carbon dioxide and water and turn those into sugar and oxygen, all in the presence of sunlight. Or not all in the presence of sunlight, partially in the presence of sunlight. But we can't do it without sunlight. Sunlight is our energy input for this process. So a little overview. This might be about the length of a lecture and a half. I'm still not sure whether I'm going to post it in one page or 2 pages. We'll see how it goes. So first we'll look at chloroplast anatomy. Then we'll look at light so we can better understand how that is influencing this process. Then we'll look at photosynthesis in a few different stages. This kind of 4-stage breakdown, these first 3 are all in one stage. So we'll have this light-dependent part and a light-independent part called the Calvin cycle that can take place whether there's light currently present or not. And then we will look at types of photosynthesis. So different plants in different environments might make use of a different photosynthetic strategy. Chloroplasts and mitochondria are really similar. Normally when I teach this class, when we don't have the cell bio prereq, or didn't have the cell bio prereq, I would teach cellular respiration first. But it's assumed that you already know about that process. So if you don't remember much about cellular respiration, I would go through the module 0 and look stuff up, because that process is complementary to this process. It takes place in a similar type of organelle. The products and reactants are just the reverse, and the stages that happen are again just sort of like the stages in reverse. So mitochondria and chloroplasts look very similar because they were both obtained from a similar process, that primary endosymbiosis of engulfing another organism somehow and eventually over evolutionary time acquiring it as an organelle, so a functional part of a cell. So both of them look very similar with their many layers of folded membrane inside, as well as their double layers of membrane. One from the, well, never mind. I'm not going to talk about membranes because it gets complicated. So here's our process of primary endosymbiosis that you should be familiar with, because we talked about this in our organismal groups. We had our free-living cyanobacterium. It was engulfed by a heterotrophic eukaryote that was eating other organisms. It didn't get broken down, and we don't know exactly how this process worked. They could have been living next to each other and sort of operating in a symbiosis that eventually became an endosymbiosis. Maybe it wasn't intentionally eaten. We don't know. But eventually, it ended up inside of another cell. And that relationship was successful. And so that organism was able to survive and reproduce, potentially better than other organisms around it. And that organelle was then passed down to those offspring because it was able to replicate inside this cell. And eventually, some of the control over that organelle would be transferred to this cell's nucleus. So let's look at those chloroplasts. So here we have a list of terms that you should know. These will be useful in your lab when you're labeling the chloroplast. I think that's in this week's lab. There's a few other ones on here, like stroma lamellae. That's not necessarily one that I'm going to use, so you don't necessarily need to know it. And here the lumen is the thylakoid space. So you'll see in different diagrams this area inside these little pancakes will sometimes be called the thylakoid space, sometimes the lumen. Lumen just means like light, so it's a light area. So in your chloroplast, you have an outer membrane and an inner membrane, and there is a small space between those, the intermembrane space. Within the inner membrane, there is a cytosol type fluid, that jelly matrix that holds everything, called the stroma. And then within the stroma, there are a series of many stacked pancake-like structures that are all connected by these strands of membrane. So what this really is just a bunch of folded membrane organized in a very neat way. Each of these little pancakes is called a thylakoid. And the area inside that thylakoid I'm going to refer to as the thylakoid space. That's orienting you with where these processes will occur. We're going to look at two different stages. We're going to look at the light-dependent stage. So when sunlight is actively being received by the plant, we'll be looking at the membrane of the thylakoid and what's happening inside the thylakoid space. When we transfer over to the light-independent stage, where we don't necessarily need light right then to do that process, we'll be in the stroma, this jelly-like matrix that's holding the thylakoids. The other big point about photosynthesis is that we are looking at energy transformations. So photosynthesis takes this electromagnetic energy that we have an abundance of arriving on our planet all the time. So if you think about Earth as I don't know where my hands are, there we go. Earth as a spaceship, right? All of the matter that we have here, like water, rocks, carbon, all that stuff, it's relatively contained, right? We don't get inputs of that. It all has to be cycled all the time. Our energy system is different. There's an input and there's an output. So our energy input is this electromagnetic energy. It is constantly providing new energy input into our Earth system. And that is required for Earth to continue to function as it does, because we have a constant energy output as well. Every time chemical reactions happen, which is happening in your body all the time, it's happening in the world all the time. If chemical reactions weren't happening and things were just at equilibrium, life would not exist. Life relies on disequilibrium. The movement of things changes. So that sort of chemical chaos is life. And every time those reactions are happening, a little bit of energy is lost. And it's lost as heat. So we have this constant output of energy, this loss of energy from our system in the form of heat. So we need a constant input. Otherwise, eventually we would run out of energy here as those reactions constantly taking place lost a little bit every time, and we didn't have a way to reharvest it. So sunlight is our energy input into our planet. That's how our whole food web starts. There are some ecosystems where the primary producers are using chemical compounds and energy from chemical compounds to make that initial source of food. But in most ecosystems, that initial source of food into the food web that provides the basis of energy that everything else is going to eat and get energy from is from sunlight. So that ultimate process is taking electromagnetic energy, energy that travels as a wave and can move through a vacuum, unlike sound, which requires other molecules to bounce off of and transfer those vibrations. And we're going to take that energy, freely available from the sun, and store it in molecules. And that molecule stored form is called chemical energy. And that's the type of stuff that we get energy from. When we eat food, we are breaking apart molecules to release the energy stored in those chemical bonds. and that's chemical energy. Okay, so we'll get into that in the next video.